Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you to Nevada for Cultural Preservation and the Nevada Site Stewardship Program for putting on this speaker series. I've watched some of the other videos, and I've checked in for some of those others, and those have been really fantastic. So thank you for bringing that to the groups and to these people that really need to hear about these important cultural resources that we have around the state here. So this evening, I want to talk to you about Big Springs. So Big Springs, the Springs Preserve. And so from Big Springs to Springs Preserve, 50 years of archaeology at the Springs Preserve. So I'm gonna sort of tell you a sort of a winding story. There's gonna be some time skips and some time jumps over there. I hope you're okay with that. We're gonna bounce around a little bit, but really I want to tell the story about the site where the Springs Preserve is currently located, the site of Big Springs, and sort of the history of the preservation of that site and sort of some of the fights that have happened for the preservation of that site and that location. So as an introduction, my name is Nathan Harper. I am an archaeologist for the Southern Nevada Water Authority for the previous 13 years. I've been the preserve archaeologist for the Springs Preserve. And so my role at SNWA is to sort of help monitor and manage the cultural resources on our properties that include the Springs Preserve. We help manage the cultural resources for the Clark County Wetlands Park, the Las Vegas Valley Wash out there in the east part of the valley. And then, of course, we have all the projects happening around the valley, lots of pipelines and vaults and other things that are going in all time. We do all the compliance for that work. And then north of Las Vegas, we have the Warm Springs Natural Area that's in the Moapa Valley. It's the headwaters of the Muddy River there that we help monitor and manage the cultural resources in that area as well. But I want to talk to you today about the Springs Preserve and what we have there. So everybody is familiar. This is the state of Nevada. Just a few months ago, I was up in Fallon at the Nevada Archaeological Association meetings, and I showed this map because I wanted to remind all the people in the rest of the state that we're all the way at the bottom, right? And this is sort of a hydrogeographic map showing the different drainage basins throughout Nevada. And of course, we're in the lower Colorado drainage basin there, but I also use this as a bit of a joke with our northern relatives there to say that all the fun and interesting things and money all drains to the south, where at the point of Nevada where we are at the bottom, just as a joke, right? And so this is the Las Vegas Valley. I'm showing this picture because I want to give you an impression of the sprawl that's been happening in the Las Vegas Valley since settlement, since European Americans came and settled in the Las Vegas Valley. Over time, that valley is slowly filled up. We're almost completely full from east to west, almost being bounded by the mountains. We're filling up to the north and the south as well, up north along Tule Springs and down to the south towards Sloan down to 15. Those areas are starting to get built up. But we're very much focused on the central portion of the valley, right there in the middle of the valley, where you can see original downtown, and that red location there, that's the location of the Springs Preserve, the site of the original Big Springs. And that little blue line that you see there running through the middle of the map, that is the Las Vegas Creek. That is the extent of the Las Vegas Creek flowing from the headwaters of Big Springs through downtown Las Vegas. And that creek would have flowed past the old Mormon Fort, past Washington Street, where over time it would flow out across the valley floor there, and that water would percolate into the ground. So there was actually not an extant portion of the creek that would have connected farther along to the Las Vegas Wash and further on into the Colorado River. Of course, we are on Southern Paiute land. We are on Nuru land here in Southern Nevada, the Las Vegas branch of the Paiute. We know would have lived around the Springs. The Nuwu people would have been here, and we have evidence of their habitation there at the Springs Preserve as well as some of our other sites there. This is an aerial photo of the Springs Preserve. We're 180 acres in total, right? And that includes 3 major springs known as Big, Middle, and Little Spring, right? Not very originally named. You can sort of joke and call them the Goldilocks Springs. All of them, they're just right. About 1.5 million gallons of water would flow out of these 3 springs, Big Spring, Little Spring, and Middle Spring, into the Las Vegas Creek. And there on the side of the Springs Preserve, you have the North Fork and the South Fork of the Las Vegas Springs, the confluence of which now would be under where the highway is located. And so about 1.5 million gallons of water would flow out of those, flow down those creeks, past the old Mormon fort, past downtown Las Vegas, where that water then would spread out and percolate into the ground. We have 2 identified sites there at the Springs Preserve, 26 CK 948, which is sort of, we call the area between the creeks. We know that there's significant cultural resources between the banks of those 2 creeks, the North Fork and the South Fork, as well as the rest of that area there, including some habitations. And then we have 26 CK 949, which is a different sort of geologic feature. Rather than being a spring pool where the water would flow up, overflow out of that pool, and then on into the Las Vegas Creek, a spring mound is a slightly different geologic formation. This is where the water underneath the floor of the Las Vegas Valley would be running through that aquifer. It would an impermeable portion of rock known as an aquitard, and that water would be forced to the surface by that artesian pressure, by the piezometric pressure of that water pushing it to the surface. So rather than forming a pool, this water would be pushed to the surface. It would soak the ground around it. Dust would blow in and gather, plants would grow and die. And over time, the height of that spring mound, the height of that mound is controlled by that artesian pressure. So this is an example of the spring mound as it would. I think this picture is from the 1930s, and you can see the spring mound is fairly tall. It's fairly conical. Over time, as those springs started to put out less water over time, that spring mound sort of dried out and sort of desiccated. So over time, that spring mound has started to deflate. It started to erode. And so what maybe the spring mound would have been about 30, 35 feet above the current ground surface. Over time, as that's eroded and sort of deflated and sort of deflated from the top, it's probably about 5 to 10 feet shorter than it would have been in this picture and others. And here down to the right, you see a group of early settlers hanging out around a spring, and I think they're sitting on the banks of what would be the Big Spring location there. Of course, we know this was always a place that was occupied by indigenous people, and so the names that the indigenous folks had for this site, Big Spring, was known as Parampaya or Akanapi. That's opening of water or big water. Middle Spring, we don't necessarily know that it had a name, but Little Spring was known as Uia or Akvampi, meaning sand boils. That tells you that that artesian pressure pushing that water up from underneath was so strong that it was actually stirring up the sediment inside that spring. So it looked like the sand was actually boiling inside of that spring. So we know that Mormon Fort was constructed in the mid 1800s, and for a few years you had a Mormon mission that was located here. Throughout the 1860s and the 1870s, Las Vegas was just sort of a way station, a way stop on the California Road, the old Spanish Trail, the Mormon Road. That would have been the main place where a lot of people would have stopped to provision, to buy grain, to water and feed their horses. We know that O.D. Gass at the time, when he was at the fort in the mid and late 1860s, he was growing alfalfa, barley, and hay. He had orchards, including apples, peaches, and apricots that he would make brandy from. He had grapes that became sort of the contentious point with the local indigenous folks here. And so he was also making wine. So it was sort of a well-known place to stop along this route here. So this is a map. I believe it's from 1906, I believe. And so this is sort of showing the extent of Las Vegas at the time. All the pink land that you see there in pink, that was all part of what was the original Las Vegas Rancho. That was owned and ran by Gass. When Gass defaulted on that property, it went to Archibald and Helen Stewart. After Archibald Stewart was killed at the Kyle Ranch, all of that property became Helen Stewart's. And in 1902, she sold off a significant portion of that land to the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad, the SPLANSL. So all of that you see in pink was then owned by the railroad. And they wanted to buy this land primarily to manage the springs because they needed water for their locomotives. Las Vegas was the main division point between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. And so having a regular water supply was absolutely necessary if they were going to keep the railroad running. Now, it was always known as a place of Indian gardens, a location of Indian gardens. If you look at the writings of Isabella Kelly and the notes that she wrote, she discusses how gardens were set up throughout the valley, usually around springs. Sometimes there would be small ditches or channels or canals that would run off of these springs and off of these creeks to feed into fields that would have been planted with sunflowers and amaranth, traditional three oysters, corn, beans, and squash, devil's claw for making baskets, other things like this. And these would have been managed springs, managed gardens that would have been not necessarily owned by a particular group or a particular family, but they would have been known places where these families would have spent time. And so the Big Springs area was always known as a place, a location of Indian gardens. Prior to Gass's ownership and management of the property, two men, J.B. Wilson and John Howell, had owned the two sections of land that included the Las Vegas Springs and the Las Vegas Creek going off towards what would become downtown. J.B. Wilson, after a couple years, left and went out and founded Sandstone Ranch, which eventually became Spring Mountain Ranch there on the foot of the mountains there. And John Howell stuck around and owned all 320 acres, including the springs and the creek. John Howell, we know from tax rolls and from census records, he was as a man listed of mixed race from North Carolina. So it's very possible that John Howell was enslaved, or perhaps the son of enslaved people, and at the time owned all 320 acres, including the springs and the creek, ran hay, alfalfa, barley, had orchards of apples and apricots and peaches, as mentioned before. And still today, sometimes we find peach pits out across site, whether they were some old well-filled workers' lunch snack, or whether they were from those orchards, still remains to be seen. Eventually, that passed to Octavius Decatur Gas, and then eventually to the Stewarts and the railroad from the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad. That land was then transferred to the Union Pacific, and then eventually the Las Vegas Valley Water District in the early and mid 1950s. So because this place was always known as a place of Indian gardens, there were always stories of people, kids, other townsfolk going out and collecting on site, collecting pottery, collecting projectile points, arrowheads, other artifacts that they would find out there. We know that there was a Boy Scout cabin that was built out there in the 1930s. Only lasted about a year before it burned down. Whether or not that was a Boy Scout trying to earn his fire making badge or not, we'll never know. We did some excavations out there. Patty Wright, previous archaeologist here at the Springs Preserve, did excavations out there in the 2000s as an Eagle Scout project, and actually found a button from a Boy Scout uniform and a little Boy Scout penknife, all with the logos on it. Which is very nice to see. So early Las Vegas was not a big town. For most of its early history, you had fewer than 2,000, fewer than 3,000 people living in the Las Vegas town site proper. One of the early names in Las Vegas was John S. Park. Here in town, we have the John S. Park Historic Neighborhood. That's named after one of the early, you could argue, one of the early town founders, one of the town fathers, John Park. He was actually the cashier for the First State Bank. And we have a replica of the First State Bank there at the Springs Preserve, and a picture of John Park on the wall. His son, William S. Park, was sort of the apple of the eye of his father and his mother and his family, and was well cared for. They sent him off to be educated in California at boarding schools. He went off and became a dentist, then returned to Las Vegas and actually served a long time serving in various civic roles throughout the Las Vegas Valley. He was one of the first founding members of the Las Vegas Rotary as well. You know, like a lot of dentists in those early days, he had a lot of interest. He did a lot of different things. He was also an avocational geologist. And so there's several sources for rocks and minerals in the river mountains that he identified previously himself. So in the 1930s, William S. Park came out to Big Springs and conducted some excavations. And while they're doing these excavations, he claimed to have found a 4 to 5 room pueblo on site and stone-lined storage pits. Now, stone-lined, slab-lined storage pits are not something that we necessarily see fairly commonly here in the Las Vegas Valley. And to our knowledge, nobody has ever identified a pueblo construction here in the Las Vegas Valley. Now, we don't necessarily know if that's what he found, if there was actually a 4 to 5 room pueblo there. There was some suggestion that perhaps he was identifying some pit houses or other things. Recently, talking with Jenny Lucas and Molly Frierson, Donald, previous archaeologist up there at Lost City, they were able to identify some of the artifacts that Park excavated from those 1930 excavations. Some of those had been sort of deposited, accessioned into the Lost City collection. And so here over the last couple of years, I've been speaking with Jenny and see if there was a way to relocate those. And also recently, I was at UNLV Special Collections doing research on some of what I'm going to talk to today, particularly about Claude and Liz Warren's work there at Big Springs. And I found this image right here that it's a fax. And what they did is these are the artifact cards from Park's work. And you can see it says the date 1937 is when he out there. He took little tracings of the projectile points that were found there and sort of described them. And so we have these artifact cards, and these copy and this fax roll was actually in Liz Warren's collected papers there at UNLV Special Collections. And I'd seen some of these before, but not the entire list. And so we're working with Lost City and Jenny Lucas right now. They're going to be deaccessioned from Lost City, from the state collection. They're going to be returned to the Springs Preserve. And hopefully here in the next couple of years, we'll be able to do there's not a lot of material there. Might be able to do a little bit of analysis and maybe put some of that information up online for people to see. When I say that Park was an avocational geologist, this is him in his workshop at his house. This is from the Desert Magazine, which was a publication, longstanding publication here in the Western United States about desert life in California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico. And he was profiled in the newspaper, in the magazine, talking about his work as a geologist primarily, but also as an archaeologist. And if you look closely on his table there, you can see that there are some projectile points. You can see there's some pottery that he's collected as well. But he was well known as somebody who found some onyx deposits in the River Mountains. And in this magazine article, they actually describe how you can get those. So if you know where the basic B is up on the hill, you have to go a little bit below that, and there's a deposit of maybe not necessarily proper onyx, but pseudo onyx, and he has several items that were polished and set, and I think some of those polished stones are at the Lost City collection as well. This article, I believe, is from 1947. It was actually published shortly after he passed away. He was actually on a trip with geologists walking around in the River Mountains and had a heart attack and passed away in Boulder City. So, beginning in the 1930s, people had known that Indian Gardens were out there. They were going out collecting arrows and everything, but really it was Park's work out there that made people realize, like, yeah, there's a deeper history. There's a deeper history of habitation at this location and at this site. So the site was recognized as significant for indigenous and early settler history. And when the Las Vegas Valley Water District came into ownership in the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Las Vegas Valley Water District really tried to find any sort of responsible agency that could help manage these resources or even take over the management of that area of the Springs Preserve that was previously called the North Wellfield. It's still an operating wellfield. There's historic wells dating back to the 1920s. In fact, coming up next summer, 2024, will be the 100th anniversary of well number 1 being drilled on the North Wellfield site. So you have wells, reservoirs, settling basins, all of that water facilities that were built there through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that are there as well. So the Las Vegas Valley Water District wrote to the city of Las Vegas, asked them to perhaps help with taking over the management, wrote to Clark County, wrote to state parks, wrote to state highways, trying to find any agency that could help them. So it was a difficult row to hoe, and despite all that, it was still recognized as an important place. And so in this image here, you're seeing this is the blueprints for the standard sort of state historic marker that you see around the state. There was a historic marker that was placed at the Springs in the late 1960s and was there through probably about the early 2000s, when that marker was lost during the initial construction of the Springs Preserve in the early 2000s and early 2000s there. So you see, this is an example of a letter. This was written in April of 1972. This is from the general manager of the Springs Preserve at the time. His name was Tom Rice, writing to the board of directors. And it goes on to say that they contacted the city of Las Vegas and the city commission and tried to convince the city that they should help with the management of this. But I want you to look at the last line there. Memorandum from Norm Sauer, who was director of the Preservation Society at the time, to the commission, and the letter from the city clerk of Las Vegas to the water district concerning the rejection by the city of Las Vegas of any connection for the creation of a historical site. So as early as the 1970s, the early 1970s, the city of Las Vegas was like, yeah, we'd love to, but we're not going to help you with this development and management of this historic site. And so this is what it sort of looked like in the 1960s, the 1970s. It was still in people's consciousness. The site was open. You know, any conversation you have with people who are born and raised here in Las Vegas, they talk about going out and riding their bikes, riding horses, collecting arrowheads, collecting pottery from across this site. It was just sort of a big playground for kids who wanted to go out and play in the creeks and the ponds that were still flowing out there. But I also want to point out the road and the highway that's running right there along the northern perimeter, the northern periphery of the Springs. So we're actually sort of floating up above Twin Lakes, Lorenzi Park, looking to the southwest. That little house that you see right there, this is Little Spring. That's the Little Spring house right there. A little bit farther over here, this is where Big Spring was located. And looking at this picture makes me sort of reconsider our thoughts about where people were staying, where people were stopping. Big Spring doesn't necessarily look like the big watered area when you would come across this site. You look at Little Spring and Middle Spring that would be just adjacent. It's much more lush, much more larger trees. It would have been much cooler for travelers. And then plus just to the west of this location, you had open desert. So when we talk about people like Fremont Party coming through there and staying here at Big Springs, I wouldn't be surprised if they were staying to the west or more open desert just adjacent to those springs. Now, at the same time, this was sort of happening. You know, the water district was trying to find sort of responsible parties to help them take care of it. Dr. Claude Warren and Dr. Elizabeth Warren moved to Las Vegas in 1969. Dr. Claude Warren had been an archaeologist working in at UC San Bernardino, working in the California deserts. He had been working for the highway departments up in Idaho, and came to UNLV in the late 1960s, and in very short time period became chair of the department there and helped develop the Department of Anthropology, Ethnic Studies there at UNLV. So at the time all of this is going on, you know, Claude and Liz Warren arrive in Las Vegas, and reading about some of Liz's work, she said one of the best things you do every time you move into town, you want to learn what the history of the place, you want to learn what's important to the history of the place, what's important to the people there, and also what needs to be preserved and what's being challenged there. So they showed up in the Las Vegas Valley looking for preservation projects, looking for questions and projects to help work on. They helped form a group called the Friends of Big Springs, and it was through that group that the site of the Las Vegas Springs. The Big Springs archaeological site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. And in fact, Liz Warren wrote her dissertation, her PhD dissertation in history at Washington State University on the Las Vegas Springs, the history of the Las Vegas Springs. And her dissertation is available online. You can find it at UNLV. You can find it online at a lot of other places. And if you knew Liz Warren, she was dedicated, dogged, and would not give up until she had an answer that she was satisfied with. And you can really see that in her dissertation work. It's extremely thorough, very well done, very well written. So when they arrived in the Las Vegas Valley, they were developing the Department of Anthropology, Ethnic Studies, and if you notice on this letter, law enforcement, Department of Anthropology, Sociology, Ethnic Studies, and Law Enforcement all together as an academic department at UNLV at the time. They approached the Southern Nevada Historical Society. Norm Sauer was working with them. And they said, what needs to be done here in the Las Vegas Valley? And the spring site was always identified as a place that needed to be preserved and needed to be protected. And so in the early 1970s, Claude and Liz, working with the Southern Nevada Historical Society, formed the Big Springs Historic Site Committee. And Claude proposed to the Historical Society to do excavations and work there. And through the auspices of the Southern Nevada Historical Society, contacted the Las Vegas Valley Water District to propose a project at the site. Okay. And so writing back, so you see the date on this one, the first letter there is April 18th, 1972. By April 28th, 1972, they'd written to Tom Rice saying, we would like to do this project there. Just a few days later, Tom Rice of the Las Vegas Valley Water District, the general manager, writes back to Claude Warren on May 3rd saying, yes, we approve. We would like to have you do this work, and proposed a contract, actually, and closed a contract in just 5 short days to Claude Warren to do this work. So the question now is, how much were they getting paid on this contract? How much did it cost to do a field work? So pull out your napkins, pull out your pencils, do some back of the envelope calculations on what you would charge to dig, I don't know, probably about approximately 30 test pits, do artifact analysis and cataloging, and write a report. How much do you think that would cost? Well, they had a budget of $800 back in the day to do about, about 50 days of work out on site, excavate, a number of test trenches and do all the artifact analysis and write that report. They charged the water district $800 for that. There's always a need to get more money into archaeology, even back then, 50 years ago. So at the same time, Claude was working with the water district to get a contract and get agreements in place to go out and do the work. Liz was working through the Southern Nevada Historical Society and in the public to raise awareness about the Big Springs site and what was happening at the Big Springs site. And this is May of 1972. So remember, those initial conversations were happening in middle and end of April in 1972. They had a contract in place by May 3rd of 1972. And at the same time, Liz Warren is trying to bring it to the public in May of 1972 through the Southern Nevada Historical Society. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that work here in a second, but with the work done in the 1970s, throughout the 1980s, there was always development pressure on the site at the Springs Preserve. In fact, there's a well-known story of work that was planned to be done there in the 1980s. Of course, we all know that there was massive flooding happening across the Las Vegas Valley in the 1970s and the 1980s, very famously seeing cars wash through the Tropicana garage and being pushed out of the Tropicana garage by floodwaters. And so Throughout the 70s and 80s, there was a massive project to build flood detention basins and flood channels throughout the Las Vegas Valley. And on site there at the Springs Preserve, what we call our Cienega, which is a trail and ponds where people can walk, that is actually a flood detention basin that was constructed in the 1980s. And if not for the work of Claude Warren and the Friends of Big Springs and Liz Warren, that flood detention basin would have been right in the middle of the site and would have destroyed all of this historic archaeology that we're going to be discussing, right? You know, the story is that Claude showed up to the city council meeting at the time, and Ron Lurie, who was the mayor, said, "We've done everything we were supposed to do. We did all the reports, we did all the analysis. There's nothing out there." And Claude said to him, just give me one day, come out, and I will show you where all the archaeology is." And well, it was a bit intimidating for Lurie and some of the other city council members that came out, because they said there was nearly 100 people from the public, from the Friends of Big Springs, from the Southern Nevada Historical Society that were out there at the time. And the front page of the Las Vegas Sun from that day in 1988, there's a picture of Ron Lurie and Claude Warren walking off across the site in the distance. And then there's an inset photo of Ron Lurie's hand holding some arrowheads and pottery. And so if not for that strong advocacy by the Warrens, the site once again would have been destroyed. Now, if you look at a map of the Springs Preserve, you're going to notice that there's sort of a big hump that goes over the top of it. And it's the same sort of situation. The 95 was going to be expanded. It was going to be built. They were going to build new interchanges and things, and it was going to go right through the middle of the Big Springs location, right? And so work done by, once again, the Water District really championed this site, brought in the Harry Reid Center for Environmental Studies at the time. They came out and did a full survey. And if not for the archaeology of the site, they would have built that highway right through the middle of it, right? And so there was a time period where sort of the public knowledge, the public identity of the Springs was sort of lost. And so throughout the 80s and the 90s, you know, people would drive down the highway and they'd look over the fence and say, "What's that over there?" But they didn't really know. The waters had stopped flowing, the springs had stopped flowing in the late 50s, early 1960s, and the importance of the site was overlooked for that time period. So as that highway was going to be expanded once again in the late 90s, 98, 99, conversations between state and federal highways and the Las Vegas Valley Water District really convinced the highway project that they needed to shift things again. And that's really what spurred the construction of the Springs Preserve as an institution. That highway work in the late 1990s. So through the early 2000s, there were lots of public meetings, public comments, public design meetings, and the Springs Preserve was built and constructed from 2005 and opened in 2007 to the public, and we've been open to the public since then. And here we are. We like to claim that we are the birthplace of Las Vegas. The meadows aren't going to be growing if there's no water. So we like to argue that we're the birthplace of Las Vegas. We're the place where the meadows existed. I don't know if we're going to have a rumble with Old Mormon Fort or not. They claim, I think now they're starting to claim the real birthplace of Las Vegas. So I don't know. We might have to have some discussions with them. So just a few years ago, working with Rayette and working with Nevadans for Cultural Preservation, we contracted them to do some work for us. So we have all of the original field notes. We have original draft of the report. We have original notebooks of people that were working out there, and working with Rayette, we scanned all of that material in, and in celebration of the 50th anniversary of that work, we developed an online exhibit and an online database of those papers. And you can actually visit them on our website. If you go to the Springs Preserve website and go to the archaeology page, you can click through it. It'll take you to the past perfect page where you can look at some of those documents. So thank you to Rayette and NVFCP for the work on that. Really fantastic. So this is a cover of the original copy of the report that was given to the Las Vegas Valley Water District at the time. Dr. Claude Warren, he had a crew, Lawrence Alexander, Peter Terrest, Hal Turner, Edward Sussard, Montgomery, Nancy and Bernard Serafman. Some of those are familiar names. Peter Terrest, Andreas Terrest was an archaeologist, archaeology student who did quite a bit of work here. Hal Turner, a very familiar name to those who do archaeology and historic preservation in Nevada as well. So here we are again. This is an aerial view of the Springs Preserve. This gives you a nice view of that curve of the highway. That highway would have come straight through there. This is that flood detention basin, our Cienega, that would have been right over here. And the areas that they investigated while they were here, the test units, they focused very much on the South Fork of the Las Vegas Creek in this location here. And then the area that they called the Central Flat, which is right over there, right? So this is a map showing 26 CK949, which is the spring mound, and 26 CK948, the area between the creeks, and showing the locations of their various test units and test excavations there. All the artifacts that were collected from these excavations are in the collections at the Springs Preserve. And this includes projectile points, Elko ear points, desert side notch points, Rose Springs, Rose Gates, Pueblo style pottery, shell beads from the California coast, everything you would expect to find on a habitation site. In the early 2000s, the archaeologist at the time at the Springs Preserve, Greg Seymour, and his staff, including Jody Dalton, Hal Rager, Jake Hickerson, who's the archaeologist up in Caliente, we're doing work out here, and they returned to the Central Flat area to confirm again that there was preserved deposits there. So these are the excavations from 2001, and you can sort of, I want to show you, that's the edge of a semi sort of circular pit house. The darker soil on the inside is the fill on the inside, and that includes some burned elements of arrowweed and willow. That we actually had some sort of baked earth impressions of arrowweed from soil that might have been put on the outside of this this habitation, this kani. We sort of call it a pit house, but it's not really a pit house. It's more of a field house. There's a hearth that was located in there, and it's mostly just a basin. It's not a formalized plastered hearth like you might see in other locations. Now, this entire area where this habitation was excavated, there's about 80 plus thermal features, roasting pits, earth ovens, ornos throughout there. And so that whole surface is just covered in fire-cracked rock from those roasting pits. As they excavated in down in there, everything, like you said, you would expect to see in a habitation, ground stone, stone tools, debitage from making stone tools, shell beads, animal bones from rabbit and lizard, bits of corn cob came out of this hearth as well, and we date that hearth to anywhere between 1270. It's about 1270 BP, so anywhere between about 670 and 870 AD, this was occupied. And this is about the time you see a large population increased in the Lost City sites, so it's very possible you had definitely had people coming down from Lost City who would have been visiting this area. And so that's that hearth that you see there. And once again, like I said, it's not a very formal hearth, right? There's no plaster. It just seems to be a sort of a scraped out basin with ash in it, but you can see that there's ashy fill throughout there. Some of the cores, there's a stone tip of a drill, projectile point there, and debitage that came out of there. Something else to note is prevalence of North Creek, Moapa, and Logandale grays. All those would have come from Muddy River and Lost City sites up there. One of the other locations that was investigated by Claude Warren's group in 1972 was this circular depression right here. And on top of that circular depression, there was rusted metal, rusted cans, historic glass bits. They found some shell casings, cartridge casings as well. And they put a 2 foot by 10 feet test trench adjacent to that circular depression trying to catch and see what some of that habitation was. And they suspected that this was a historic period habitation just because of the artifacts that they were finding on the surface. So in that slit trench that they put in, they found a hearth. Once again, not terribly formal hearth, but two stones with lots of charcoal in them. Maybe they had a grate over it. Maybe they were cooking food over the top of it. There were adobe bricks that were found in there, as well as large cottonwood beams, not only probably from roof beams, but also from uprights to hold that roof up. And so in Claude's excavations, he estimated that this may have been a semi-subterranean house dug down into the ground, maybe about 2.5 or 3 feet, built up on the side with adobe bricks, and then a cottonwood beam roof covered with thatch on top of that. Now, he argued that it probably wasn't occupied for a very long time, but some of the artifacts that were able to come out of that included some cartridge cases that had a very specific manufacture date. We're also looking at a time where you're transitioning from black powder to smokeless powder. So the technology was changing. Firearms technology was changing. Technology associated with doing your own loads for your cartridges was changing as well. And so 2 artifacts that we found in there, this cartridge casing and this cartridge casing right here, which was found in the 2008 testing that went back, are part of what are called a balloon base cartridge, similar to this. Almost all of the cartridge casings that were manufactured after the transition to smokeless powder have what was called a solid base. And so that primer cap that was in the base was inserted in that solid base. For the balloon base, it was not as solid. It had a thin little shell of balloon metal where the primer went in. And that is very distinct. And that type of shell casing was only made between about 1870 and 1890. Early 1900s. And so as an archaeologist, anybody doing any sort of work on that type of thing, when you see a date that's that tight, you get really excited, because then it means you can start looking at more historical records and primary records. And so when we go back and look at those primary records from the 1870s, that's when we start to see J.B. Wilson and John Howell's name start to appear in that record. So while we do not have direct evidence that J.B. Wilson or John Howell lived in this dugout, the time period fits exactly when those 2 people would have been living at the site here. So we have sort of suggested that perhaps this was a dugout that John Howell lived in. We also know that Howell married a Paiute woman, Mary, and had 4 children, 3 children of which he lived with most of the rest of his life, Albert, Jeannie, and Charlie. He had another son that was born when he was living and working out in El Dorado Canyon and doing mining out there. They moved out to Pahrump, moved out to Beatty, and lived in Oasis Valley for several years. And actually, in the 1930s, when Julian Stewart, well-known cultural anthropologist, ethnographer working in the Western United States, visited Ash Meadows in the 1930s, he actually interviewed Albert Howell, John Howell's son, and has a picture of John Howell standing in the door of his dugout out in Ash Meadows. So it's interesting to see that cultural continuity there. Something else that's really interesting in these excavations is we've actually found a cap from Hazard's black powder. It was from a black powder flask that would have been used for reloading cartridge casings. We found that in this habitation as well. So when archaeologist at the time, Patty Wright, who was archaeologist at the time, returned to this site in 2008 to do some test excavations, it's very rare that you get to do the archaeology of archaeology. So they actually found this original 2-foot by 10-foot trench, excavation trench, excavated by Claude Warren and his crew in 1972. And so you can see it identified there. And again, in this picture, that's that slit trench that was excavated by Warren then. And so you can see a little bit of the tumble here. You can see some of the stone base, and you can see some adobe blocks that would have been part of the wall that collapsed inside of that dugout house there. So it's been really exciting to sort of revisit this work, and really excited to have this up online for people to see it. Some of the other things that we're working on right now at the Springs Preserve is coming up. We We've been working on this one for several years now. One of our well derricks on site is suffering from subsidence. That is, shows evidence of the overpumping that happened around the Las Vegas Valley in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And actually, there's a map from the late 1940s showing over 800 wells across the Las Vegas Valley. And you can pretty much guarantee that none of those had meters on them. Nobody was monitoring who was pumping out what and how much water was coming out of the ground in that time. So really it was the late 40s, early 50s when that water pumping, water usage really became extreme. And this well, this is well derrick number 5. This is the one you can see when you're driving down the highway. And you can tell that well derrick's starting to lean a little bit. And that's because of the history of subsidence at that location. So there are 4 water well derricks on site there at the Springs Preserve. There's one at the corner of Charleston and Valley View on the campus of the Las Vegas Valley Water District. And these all date to the 1940s. We have the original blueprints for them. And similar to drilling a well derrick, you have to have, or drilling an oil well, you have to have a derrick. You have to have a superstructure there to be able to lift the pipe and the chain and be able to get the casing down in that borehole. And rather than bringing in a temporary well derrick to come in and service those wells over time, they just decided it was better and more economical to leave the wooden well derricks there so they wouldn't have to re-erect a derrick to do the maintenance. These were originally restored in 1999 and work done by HRC, again, Harry Reid Center, including folks like Jeff Wedding that were out there doing work around these well derricks. That's the last time they were restored. So we're currently working through a project to restore the existing derricks, and then we're hoping to sort of at this well derrick number 5 that's starting to lean a little bit, we're going to dismantle it, put in some new footings underneath the ground to hold that well derrick up, and then we're going to re-erect it to make sure that derrick is going to be preserved and it's not going to fall down over time. So we're continuing sort of the tradition of preservation there at the Springs Preserve. We're continuing the work of the Warrens. We're continuing the work of John S. Park. And we want to make sure that this place is going to be preserved, it's going to be presented, and it's going to be protected for generations of Las Vegans in the coming years. So thank you very much for letting me talk to you today. Thank you to UNLV Special Collections, Rayette, and NFCP, the State Museum, and Indian Fort Terry for his help with this presentation.